Good morning. It's Monday, the 6th of December. This is Jamaica Live. Welcome to the program. I'm Bruce Golding. We're broadcasting here on Bridge 99. We broadcast locally from 12 to 1, and then at 1 o'clock we link with Irie Jam in New York, where we kind of engage with the Jamaicans in that vast Jamaican metropolis. I call it Jamaican metropolis because, you know, if you fly into New York and you walk on any street, you're going to bump into Jamaicans anywhere you go. So many of them are up there. And I gather that in a short while we're going to be broadcasting, live streaming through to Toronto as well, where there's another large community of Jamaicans. So welcome to the program. Jamaica's modern political development can be said to have had its foundation in the labor unrest of 1938 and the emergence of the trade union movement. It was the trade unions, in their quest to assert the rights of workers and to secure better pay and working conditions for workers, that provided the political muscle that eventually led to universal adult suffrage, the right of everyone over, at that time, the age of 21, the right to vote and to choose our legislative representatives. This is what led to the formation of the two political parties that have dominated Jamaican politics ever since: the People's National Party in 1938 and the Jamaica Labour Party in 1943. The labor movement, or the trade union movement, terms that are used almost interchangeably, has been through many phases in its evolution, periods of turmoil and volatility, when industrial relations and the workplace environment were very adversarial and combative. Then there were periods of intense and sometimes violent rivalry among the trade unions themselves, as each sought to secure and defend trade union turf. But toward the end of the last century, the trade unions, led and inspired by some of the titans of the labor movement of the time, the late Hugh Shearer, the late Michael Manley, the late Hopetoun Kavan, and the late Eloy Taylor, came to the determination that the common cause that they were pursuing required a common approach, a more united, more collaborative approach. And that gave birth to the establishment of the Joint Confederation of Trade Unions, the JCTU, which brought all the trade unions, which had previously been engaged in such intense rivalry, brought all of them together under one big tent. A major factor in that transformation was the changes that were taking place at the workplace. Technology, globalization, and market competition were redefining the way in which goods and services were produced, distributed, and sold. And this was having a profound effect on job creation and job security. The ways of the workplace were changing rapidly, and this demanded changes in industrial relations practices. One may also say labor market culture. But it demanded much more than that. In the earlier dispensation, governments, responding to the advocacy of the trade unions, had enacted a raft of labor market laws and regulations designed to protect workers. Some of those laws and regulations just did not fit in the new dispensation. And instead of providing protection for workers, they could ultimately cost those very workers their jobs. As investments became able to move more freely from one country to another, job security became more fragile. As technology and automation changed production processes, worker skills, and the ability to adapt became more demanding. The laws and regulations that we had put in place to govern the labor market had to be transformed. The need for modernization became extremely urgent. And so in the early 1990s, a committee was set up. It was during the administration of Prime Minister P.J. Patterson. A committee was set up, the Labor Market Reform Committee, led by the late Professor George Eaton, to undertake a comprehensive review of the Jamaican labor market, all the laws and regulations that were in place, the practices that had developed and almost become entrenched, the traditional worker-employer relationships, industrial relations practices, and a host of other issues. Critical among these were the matter of labor productivity. Labor productivity, which meant the quality and the value of the worker's contribution in the production of goods and services. Critical also were issues such as training and skills improvement, how to ensure that the Jamaican worker is fit for purpose. As well, there was the issue of worker participation in the decision-making processes and the extent to which this is a significant contributory factor in optimizing productivity and maximizing output. You know, the workers have a stake. I mean, their job is primarily their stake. And when you're on the production line, when you're on the factory floor, when you're in the shop, if decisions are being made and you are not invited to participate in those decisions, you can end up with a disconnect. And therefore, worker participation, how you create a framework in which workers are consulted, their views are sought, their suggestions are taken into account, became important. The issue of labor productivity commanded significant attention in the report of the committee. It continues to be a major issue that affects the performance of our economy, our ability to compete with foreign producers of goods and services, not only in the export market, which is a point I keep making. When we're talking about ability to compete, people very often think that, well, that's the ability to put the goods we manufacture in a container, send it abroad, and find a market for it. But we have to compete right here on our supermarket shelves, our own supermarket shelves, because with globalization and the reduction of tariffs and the removal of non-tariff barriers, goods move freely from one country to another. It's not like in the 60s when, if you wanted a box of matches, to import a box of matches, you have to get a license to do that. That no longer applies. Right here on our own supermarket shelves, we have to compete with the foreign producers every day. And in that kind of scenario, the job security that our workers can enjoy and the quality of wages that they are paid are directly linked to the issue of productivity. Labor productivity in particular, but as we're going to be discussing later in the program, it's not just labor productivity alone. It's what is called in economic terms factor productivity, which involves the capital that is invested, the quality of the management that is provided, and so on. We're going to be talking about that. Let me explain it this way, because I think it's important for people to understand it. You know, economics, as complex as it may be as a science, it can be broken down into language that me and you can understand. So let me explain it this way. If it takes the foreign worker 1 man-hour to produce a particular item, but it takes the Jamaican worker 1.5 man-hours to produce the same item, the cost of making the foreign item is going to be cheaper. So we can't sell our local made item in that foreign market. It's going to be too expensive. And we're not going to be able to sell it in our own market here because the foreign item will come in, pay the customs duty, and still push the local made item off our supermarket shelves. Or alternatively, the foreign worker will be paid a better wage for making the same item because he's more productive. He takes less time to produce it. Or it may well be a combination of both. The data that tracks labor productivity in Jamaica, especially when compared with labor productivity in other countries, is troubling. Very troubling. Since the beginning of this century, since 2000, labor productivity in Jamaica has declined by over 11%. This means that in 2020, it took the Jamaican worker working an 8-hour shift almost an extra hour to produce the same amount of work that he was producing back in the year 2000. When we compare ourselves with other countries in the region, like the Dominican Republic and like Trinidad and Tobago, their workers are moving in the opposite direction. In Trinidad, for example, labor productivity has increased by 88% since 2000. We have declined by 11%. They have increased their labor productivity by 88% since 2000. So what would have taken a Trinidad worker a full 8-hour shift to do in the year 2000? Him now backs that off in 5 hours. And because he's more efficient, producing more goods in less time, he's able to demand higher pay. The country's economy is able to grow faster. It is able to export more goods and earn more foreign exchange. That's what they call economic growth. A big part of our labor productivity problem has to do with the skill sets of the Jamaican worker. I want you to listen to this little piece of statistic. Listen to it carefully. According to the Economic and Social Survey, which is published annually by the Planning Institute of Jamaica, 2/3, hear me, 2/3 of the labor force in Jamaica, that means 2 out of every 3 people, 2 out of every 3 workers, have no formal training in any particular skills. Remember some time ago, I don't know what we were discussing on this program, I spoke about people who, when I was a member of parliament, would come to me asking me to help them to get a job. And when I would ask them, well, what kind of work can you do? Anything, boss. I said, that is the hardest job to find. I don't know of any employer that I can go and say, let's now have a guy here who is qualified in anything. See if you can find a place for him for me. It don't work that way. But 2/3 of the labor force in Jamaica have no formal training in any marketable skills. I mean, they may be able to work the dance hall and they may be able to, skank and all them kind of thing. But when it comes to doing work, productive work, they have no training. How the devil are we going to be able to cut it in this day and age? How are we going to compete with other countries? How is the country going to achieve economic growth? And not just economic growth, but economic development, because economic growth is only one element of economic development. And what about social development, which can hardly come about without economic development? The Professor George Eaton Committee, which was established more than 25 years ago, and there was a long interregnum of 20 years, and after that time, Jamaica finally established a permanent labor market reform commission back in 2014, 7 years ago. That commission was established to tackle this problem that I've been talking about. It identified 5 priority areas. 1, education and training. 2, industrial relations. 3, labor policies and regulations. 4, social protection. And 5, technology innovation and productivity. There are many new challenges that have emerged since the George Eaton Committee did its work. The work from home phenomenon, for example, did not come about only since COVID. It had emerged as a practice long before COVID, and it began to have an effect on the dynamics of the workplace. Work has had to be driven by initiative and a new kind of discipline, since they were no longer physically under the watchful eyes of a supervisor. The time clock, where you clock in when you come to work and you clock out when you're leaving work, that was fast becoming obsolete. The worker was very much on his own. His output was becoming more measurable. Work harder, work longer, and you earn more. But technology didn't stop there. There's a new thing called artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence. Machines have long been introduced to do things that human labor did before. That's called automation, and that has been around since the Industrial Revolution more than 200 years ago. But there was always a limit to what machines could do. It could do what hands and feet normally did, but it couldn't replace the human brain. It couldn't think. It couldn't make assessment. It couldn't do a rational analysis of a situation. It couldn't anticipate possibilities and eventualities. Well, that is not so anymore. Computer-driven technology is now doing things that in the past could only be done by the human brain. What does this mean for the labor productivity of the Jamaican worker? Because it is going to come here. Matter of fact, it is here already. I know of companies that are introducing new systems with this artificial intelligence something that is completely transforming the way in which they operate. What does it mean for our children and grandchildren in finding a work when artificial intelligence becomes as commonplace as the cell phone that everybody seems to have? What should it mean for how we educate and train our young people in the schools, from the early childhood to primary to secondary to the tertiary level. Some countries, especially in Europe, but including countries like Japan, are now talking about a thing called jobless growth, which means that the economy is growing, sometimes growing rapidly, but no new jobs are being created. In fact, the labor force in some of those countries is shrinking. This may suit them because their populations are also shrinking. Their people are having fewer and fewer children. And new entrants into the labor force are becoming less and less. We are facing challenges big time. How are we going to manage? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Labor market reform, labor productivity, labor adaptability, because our future is at stake when we come back. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live on the Bridge, Bridge 99. Today we're talking about labor market reform. It's a subject that is far more critical to our future than many of us seem to realize, and it's something we want to delve into today, to look at not just its importance in all its elements, but also how do we chart a way forward? How do we address the issues and the challenges that it poses? And I'm pleased to have on the program as my first guest today one of the deans of the trade union movement in Jamaica, the General Secretary of the Jamaica Association of Local Government Officers, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong when I bring you on, President of the Joint Confederation of Trade Unions, Mrs. Helene Davis-Whyte. Mrs. Davis-Whyte, do we have you?
Morning, Mr. Golding. Yes, you are correct. I'm also president of the JCTU.
Good. I'm so happy to have you because I believe you're going to bring considerable value to the discussion we're having today. Tell me, we had the George Eaton Committee back in the 1990s. Since that time, we have had the establishment of what I believe is a permanent labor market reform commission. That is now 7 years going. Helene, how far have we progressed since George Eaton and his team dealt with the matter?
Well, in the first iteration, which was the work done by George Eaton, the focus was primarily on labor laws, and what was attempted there is to try to ensure that the various labor laws were really keeping pace with what is happening in the labor market, and not only in Jamaica, but to compare with what is happening outside of Jamaica, because we had issues of competitiveness to deal with as well. And so the Eaton work really focused more on reform of the labor laws. Since that time, certainly we in the trade union movement have felt that we needed to move beyond just the labor laws, because truth be told, the labor market has various actors in it. It's not just about workers. There are various actors in the labor market: workers, employers, the government, and of course the private sector also as part of the employer group as well. And so what we felt needed to be done is a more comprehensive labor market reform process arising from those representation. I remember Lloyd Goodley, of blessed memory, being one of the very vocal persons in terms of the labor market. He was always out there reminding us that when we're looking at the Jamaican labor market, an issue of training and education was very important. And so for that reason, we felt that we needed to have a more comprehensive look at the labor market and reforming the labor market. And so arising out of that representation came the establishment of the Labor Market Reform Commission. I don't think it is a permanent commission as such. It really was established to inquire into and to have consultations and from there make recommendations as to what needed to be done in the context of the times to reform the labor market so that it was able to deliver on the various national goals in the area of employment and training and all these things that had to do with the labor market. That commission was actually led by Dr. Marshall Hall, and having had the consultations with various groups, they presented a report to the government of Jamaica. I think that report may have been presented just about 3 years or so ago, and it came to the Labor Advisory Council on its way to Cabinet. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter came COVID, and that process of implementing the report of the commission was halted, so to speak. And more recently, coming out of the situation with COVID, a task force was established under the chairmanship of Professor Neville Ying that was tasked with the responsibility of looking at what was happening in the labor market arising from COVID and trying to develop positions as to what should be done to ensure that Jamaica was able to recover from COVID and that the labor market would be reformed to the extent that it could deliver on the various goals that were identified coming out of the Economic Recovery Task Force. So that is basically where we are now. We now have the report from Professor Neville Ying, which is a report to the Minister of Labour. And again, a presentation was made to the Labour Advisory Council, and we now await, how Cabinet will be dealing with the latest iteration of labour market reform.
How recent is that report from Professor Ying?
Well, I know he made his presentation to the Labour Advisory Committee in August of this year.
I see.
It's quite recent.
So it's quite recent. But tell me, Helene, given the fact that the challenges that face the labour market are constantly emerging. It's an evolutionary thing. Ought the Labour Market Reform Commission not to be a permanent fixture so that it can keep under constant review all of these challenges and what our responses ought to be?
I think it would assist in the process because, when you have as important an area as, labour market, I don't know if we would necessarily call it reform at the stage where it is permanent, but you need to have the commission, certainly, a labour market commission being in place so that the focus on the labour market and making sure that what happens in the labour market and how the various actors are able to engage with each other, ensuring that our labour laws keep current with what is happening in the labour market at any point in time. I think it would be something that should be considered, that we have a permanent commission that is constantly examining what is happening and taking action in terms of making the various recommendations as to what should be done to make sure that the labour market is able to keep pace with the time, so to speak.
One of the critical focus issues, not the only one, because there are other issues, but one of the critical focus issues, as I'm sure you will acknowledge, is the question of labor productivity. I want to raise with you two aspects of that. I can't. I continue to be deeply disturbed by the data, and I have to assume that it is accurate because I have no other means of. I don't have a means of challenge it. But the data coming out of the PIOJ, which indicates PIOJ, I think they rely on statin for the actual capture, but indicates that 2 out of every 3 Jamaican workers have no formal skill training. Some of them may be very able, they may have learned on the job, but they have no formal training. Now, that is one issue. How on God's earth, Helene, are we going to prepare that labor force to go compete with the kind of technological innovations that are taking place, the artificial intelligence? So that is one issue. And the second issue related to that isn't our management of our educational system, and I'm going to all the way back to early childhood, primary, secondary, right up to tertiary. And this is something that transgresses basic common sense. Have we over the years failed to produce the kind of worker that is responsive, that is agile, that can absorb training, that can see the new technology that is emerging and just hug it up right away and get on top of it? How are we going to address that?
And I think it's a $1 million question, really. But we certainly don't believe it's impossible as long as we're focused. Because when we look at the issue of labor productivity, and we compare, we know that the evidence is that productivity within Jamaica is far below what it is in some of our Caribbean territories and within the region and globally. But when we start to go deeper into that comparison, we come up with the very information that you just quoted, that close to 2/3 of our labor force are actually untrained, certainly in relation to formal training. But I think there's some recognition of in the data of training that can take place on the job, because I think they also mention apprenticeships as well. So, the labor does take into account something like that. But then again, when we look at the Jamaican situation, the formal apprenticeship program that we used to have is not there anymore. And so people learn in a very loose way in terms of, acquiring skills while on the job. So if we have that kind of a situation, and we then go into the education programs in our school system, that again tells another tale. And so if we are to really address the issue of productivity in Jamaica, it has to start with what is happening in our school system. Is our education system geared to turn out the kind of worker who is able to compete with the best regionally and globally? And what we are finding is that in many instances it is not. You do have, we have a education system that is quite elitist in nature, because we continue to talk about the traditional secondary schools, and we differentiate them from what used to be called new secondary. I think they just call them high schools now. But the two are not equal.
Tell me.
So you will have persons who graduate from a high school, and in many instances they can barely read and write.
Yes.
And the kind of funding that should be put into those schools.
They come off the conveyor belt.
Exactly. And so they graduate and go into the workforce, and they are unable to find any place in the workforce. And then you, especially with our young men, you end up with the kind of problems we're having with crime and violence now.
Tell me.
We really have to focus on what is, starting at the early childhood level. Totally revamp, in my view, how the kind of interaction at the early childhood level. And I think it has started to some extent because where I do know that the government, and I would think successive governments, have actually been looking at this whole thing about, establishing infant schools as departments of the primary school system.
Well, let me
So
ask you
that
this,
you
though.
have a more formal kind of program in place, and that in that situation, that most of our children would benefit from that formal kind of system, and not as happened in the past, where a child would be going to a basic school, but is more like a nursery really than an institution of learning. And so the fact that that work has started, and a lot of it has come through the Early Childhood Commission, is very, very important, and really is laying the foundation, we believe, for the improvements that are needed in our high school system to ensure that we are turning out workers, because when people graduate, either they're going on to higher education or they're going directly into the workforce. And what we are seeing now is that the system is not really turning out the kinds of persons who, in a formal kind of sense, is able to do the task in the context of the current orientation of our employment in the world, where we're looking at a lot of artificial intelligence and workers who are able to think critically, and all of these are the kinds of skills that we should be honing in our graduates from our high school system.
Well, on that note, let me ask you this, and you would be in a position to know. To what extent is there any interfacing, any consultation, collaboration between, for example, the people who are designing the school curriculum and the school administrators in terms of the course offerings? To what extent is there any interfacing between those and what the labor market projections are saying? In other words, is the efforts we are making to improve the education and training of our students, is that being informed by intelligent assessment and projections as to what the labor market is going to require and what the labor market is prepared to reward 10 years and 20 years down the road?
From my recollection of the Marshall Hall report, there was a recognition that needed to be done, and they did recommend that there should be more linkages between the education system and those that are involved in terms of, skills and training for the labor market, that the Ministry of Labor needed to be more involved in that kind of in providing that kind of information, doing the proper analysis of our current economic situation, our labor market, and being able to say to prospective graduates from our institutions that these are the kinds of skills that are in demand, and that so rather than what happens now, a lot of children going into doing their CXCs and CAPE are really looking at the usual jobs, lawyer, doctor, what have you,
but
not recognizing whether or not those are skills that are in demand.
But even at the tertiary level, I did some research some time ago and actually wrote an article on it. When I looked at the employment outcomes for university graduates, a lot of them ended up in jobs that they were earning, I don't want to be disrespectful to him, but they were earning less than what my driver earns.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason for that is that perhaps they were spending 3 years at great sacrifice to their parents studying the wrong things.
Exactly.
And no,
Exactly.
apparently they didn't have available to them the kind of advice that would say, hey, that's maybe not the best choice that you should make. Maybe you should look at this area or that area because based on our intelligence, that is what the market is requiring and is going to increasingly require in the foreseeable future. That doesn't seem to be happening.
And I think part of the difficulty is that you will have elements at various places within the public sector, but they are not coming together. So HEART does some of that in terms of being able to determine what programs they should be offering. And then you have the Ministry of Labor that has a labor market information system that really, will help in terms of being able to match persons with their, in terms of jobs, being able to match them with their skills and so on. But the education system itself is there is no kind of connection that says to the education system when we analyze what is happening with in our labor market, these are the skills that are going to be in demand. I take one in particular. We are losing a lot of our what you call them now, these people who are involved in loading and unloading
Logistics?
in that area, right? And places like Canada are taking them as soon as they get into employment and have a little experience.
Right, because we can't absorb them?
What is happening is that Canada, that has a labor shortage,
yes,
now is looking outside to be able to recruit, and they are recruiting persons who are needed in their labor market.
At attractive remuneration.
At attractive remuneration. So you have some skills that are almost dying in Jamaica, but and a lot of it is because they are actually leaving as you turn them out. They are leaving for better remuneration. And it is because, we still have a kind of archaic colonial way of looking at education. So people still have to be disabused of the idea that, you're a bright person if you are doing certain kinds of subjects. Yeah. And you're a bright person if you, I don't have anything against lawyers. But you're considered to be bright.
Yeah, and we're producing more of them than we need, tell you the truth.
That we actually need. Yeah. And if you go right across, you find that is the difficulty that we have. So there has to be, and that was the recommendation of the commission, there has to be, even if everything doesn't come under one roof, there has to be a point at which all of these agencies that are involved in providing the skills for the labor market, they are able to give information to graduates as to, what are the areas of demand and so on, that all of these entities need to collaborate with each other and that they share data. It cannot be that, we're still operating in these kind of silos.
Both of them at the same time?
That, it does not provide the kind of information for our graduates, whether from the high school system or the tertiary system, to make informed decisions as to, what they should be doing in terms of employment down the road.
Helene, I don't want to lose you. I have David One holding on the phone. Would you object to my bringing him on? Because I think it would be important to get his perspective as well.
No problem.
Sure. Try and bring on Mr. One now. David, are you there?
Afternoon, sir.
How are you?
Honorable Bruce Golding.
Yeah.
Pleased to be here.
Welcome. Thank you for joining me. I have Helene Davis-Whyte on the line as well. We're talking about labor market reform. And one of the issues I particularly wanted to raise with you, which I've been discussing with Helene, is the question of labor productivity. Now, that has been the subject of all kind of discussions in the past because our productivity has been declining. But if truth be told, David, it's not just labor productivity that has been declining. Factor productivity is declining as well, which involves capital, it involves management. Now, if I'm a worker in your factory, on your your shop floor. My productivity depends to a large extent on my own application, training, trainability, discipline, a whole heap of things. But my productivity is also going to be affected by the quality of management, no?
Yes. And the quality of equipment.
Yes, yeah. To what extent are the employers sensitive to the fact that they also have a critical role to play in terms of improving labor productivity, and what are they doing?
Well, I don't believe it's as pervasive as we'd like. A lot of employers still have a very narrow view of what labor productivity and firm productivity is driven by. And I think many of them are looking to labor only as if this person would work smarter, they would have bigger productivity. But that would be missing the point. I think many more factors come into play, particularly the technology employed by the company to assist workers in doing what they do. I think that's probably a bigger factor than the actual labor itself.
I should have told my listeners that David Wan is the president of the Jamaica Employers Federation. David, I'm willing to bet you. It's not a broad brush statement I'm making, but I'm willing to bet you that if we were to go into several factories across Jamaica, go look at the machinery that they're using, rub off the grease and dirt off the nameplate, we probably would see a lot of equipment that was manufactured 20 and 30 years ago.
I have no doubt about that.
That can't cut it now, and then we turn around and when they can't compete with their products, sometimes we want to turn around and blame the worker.
Well, yes. The only thing saving us as a country in that respect, sir, is that there are some items which are not so easy to export to Jamaica economically. For example, something that's a very low-cost item and that occupies a lot of space.
Or something that is freight heavy.
That's right. Very heavy. So, in a sense, we've been protected as a country from some level of competition that is not economical to export to Jamaica.
Helene, to what extent do you get reports, complaints from the workers that you represent? By you, I mean the broad trade union movement. That the system in here just screwed up. The machine will and broke down every minute, and the management, half of the time them not here because them gone for lunch that lasts from 11 o'clock till 3 o'clock. To what extent do you get a sense that there has been a failing in terms of capital investment, in terms of the quality and responsiveness and agility of management that is then reflected in the cost of production, which so often is now blamed on the worker to say, well, it's the worker's productivity that is the problem?
We get the complaint quite a lot. There are companies that, are on the cutting edge. But when you look at, the one is in relation to the structure of our economy. A lot of it is really in the informal sector. So when you take that out, because I think the last estimate was about close to 50% of employment is in the informal sector, and in that sector, people tend to operate on a basis of what happens on a daily basis rather than plan ahead. And the kind of strategic direction is not there because they're not looking at what is happening in the general marketplace a lot. And even in the more formal sector, we get complaints that it appears that in many instances, employers are more interested in the kind of car they drive than in the equipment that is in their factories and operations generally to be able to, increase the cost of production. But at the same time, they are very clear as to what is the cost, the labor cost that is involved in that production. And the first thing that one looks at is
wages,
the labor cost.
Yeah, okay.
But the truth is, as has been shown elsewhere in the world, and I think also here in Jamaica, when you do the comparisons, when you make that investment in research and development and retooling and properly equipping your organization, you get returns as far as the input of the worker, because then the worker is now able to do so much more than they would have been able to do with the outdated equipment or with, very little equipment. And so I think because the focus over the years has been on labor productivity and not on total factor productivity, we have these problems. I think we need to get to the point, and I think that is part of the job of the Jamaica Productivity Center, where, the information can be shared with employers in relation to, how do they make their, not just their staff more productive, but their entire outfit more productive by having that investment in research and technology as well.
David.
Yes.
One of the things that prompted, made very necessary the whole business of labor market reform was the fact that over the years we had established a framework, an industrial relations framework, backed up by a raft of, I think, some 20-odd pieces of legislation that laid out, rules and regulations and procedures. And we found ourselves at a time when the world was changing, globalization was upon us, trade barriers were coming down, so that we found ourselves, in the days of Robert Lightman, for example, our concern was how to compete in the foreign market. We were at a stage now where we had to be competing on our own supermarket shelves. All of that suggested that the way we were doing things, first of all, constituted a disincentive to investment, so that the capital would go somewhere else. And secondly, in terms of our competitiveness, we wouldn't be able to cut it until we brought our labor market framework in line. Now, to what extent have you found that, A, the trade union movement has recognized and has been responsive to this change? And to what extent do you think that they have, in fact, been resisting? And to what extent has the government itself, in terms of its legislative and policy responsibilities, to what extent has the government been seized of the need to put in place a kind of labor market arrangement that would inure to A, attracting investment, B, achieving the level of competitiveness that we need, both here in our domestic market and abroad? What is your take on that?
Well, in some areas, I find the unions have been reasonable in their negotiations in terms of situations where if we take a certain course of action, it could mean loss of jobs. And I find that in some areas, they've been, quite encouraging to the employers about certain positions that they've taken. And as a result, over the last several years, we have not seen that many strikes and work stoppages as you used to in many years gone by. But there's also some rules that we have to make as a country that I don't want to give you an example.
Can I interrupt you right there, David? Upon the break, let me just take the time signal and I'll come right back to you. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live on Bridge 99. We have online with us Mrs. Helene Davis-Whyte, the president of the Joint Confederation of Trade Unions, as well as Mr. David Wan, the president of the Jamaica Employers Federation. We're talking about labor market reform. And David, I interrupted you. Finish your point, and I'm going to ask you, Helen, before we wrap up, if you can give me your response to that issue as well. To what extent have the critical stakeholders, and for the question I'm putting to you, Helen, is both on the union side, the labor movement side, as well as on the employer side. What is your take in terms of the responsiveness to the need? But David, go ahead and finish your point.
Right. And what we'd like to see in this particular area is some more, I call it enlightened thinking. So I had made a suggestion to the government of Jamaica that we look at a new program of accelerated depreciation so that factories and employers here in Jamaica could be incentivized to retool and be able to recoup their investment quicker to make us more productive and make us able to compete. But the response I got from very senior members of the government was we have to be very careful how we do that, because if there's labor displacement, then we have another problem on our hands, and we can't just solve that problem and end up with thousands of persons unemployed, because you now have new technology where you need 10 workers instead of 20 for the job that this factory is doing. So I think there needs to be some more enlightened thinking. Yes, there are going to be displacements if you start retooling significantly to make us more competitive locally and internationally. But let us ramp up training also, retraining of those who get displaced. There's new industries that are going to need special skills, and there's other ways we can deal with it.
To what extent, David, are employers investing in the training of their workers, particularly to make them able to adapt to the changes in technology? Or they regard that as something that government must do?
No, I find a good number of them are sensitive to the fact that technology has changed so much that if you don't train your workers to adapt to technology, it can be a hindrance on the firm and its productivity and its profitability. Yes, I found it most employers.
Are there tax incentives for doing so?
For the training, no, there are not. There's an employment tax credit to keep people on the payroll, but there's none for training purposes. That would be a real tax benefit. So we need a lot of that. But, Mr. Golding, I think the crisis we're having, in a sense, may end up being wasted in terms of training, because here is the chance we need to not only retool our labor force, so to speak, but to leapfrog where we were before, because the world is not standing still. And we need to make sure we can deal with the new technologies coming, like electric vehicles. I think in 3 to 5 years, there'll be a big percentage of the vehicles here in Jamaica will be electric. And do we have anybody who can repair electric cars? I mean, if you think that the old man with the spark plug on the, doing that is outdated because of today's electronic cars, there's another ship coming with the electric vehicles, for example. So I think we need to do a lot more in that area.
Helene, to what extent, all the stakeholders, the trade unions, of course, being one critical group of stakeholders, the employers, the government, the private sector as an umbrella kind of organization in terms of laying out perspectives and approaches and policies. To what extent are the stakeholders sensitive to the changes that are needed, some of which are not going to be particularly comfortable, some of which are going to cause dislocation, some of which are going to cause a whole new way of dealing with the workplace. But to what extent are the stakeholders seized of the inevitability of the changes that are taking place, are responsive? I'm going to put you on the spot. Who are the ones who are slow in coming up to the plate?
I think, generally speaking, certainly at the macro level, in terms of the various stakeholder groupings, certainly through our interactions at the labor market, the Labor Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Labor, and the other mechanisms that exist where the stakeholder groups meet on a regular basis. At that level, you get a sense that most people are seized of the urgency of the situation. So I think what needs to be done is to really filter that through to all the members of each of the stakeholder groupings, or as many of them as possible. Because I say that because if I look at it from the point of view of the trade union movement, we have amended our negotiating styles to take account of that very issue. We have a mantra that says, the issue now is not a job for life, but a skill for life. So what we are saying to our members is that skill remains with you for a lifetime. And so you should not be looking at keeping the job necessarily for the lifetime. You need to be adaptable so that you can move from one job to the other. And you can only do that in a situation where you have the requisite skills, and some of that would have come up in the report of of Professor Ying's labor market task force, because one of the things that he recommended is that we needed to, as a country, align competencies of graduates from education and training institutions with economic growth priorities and job creation and employment strategies established by the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force, recognizing that, that was his focus. What is the impact of COVID-19 on our economy and our workforce, as well as our workplaces, and in that context, to come up with those recommendations. So I would say that in most situations, you do get an understanding of the issues. Where we have the problem is where the rubber hits the road, and the funding arrangements should be put in place from a government perspective, because of all that is happening with our economy. Very often you find that issues like these are the first things to go when you are looking at a crisis. You don't actually see that immediately, so it sort of gets shunted by the wayside in favor of other things. And even in the individual firm, that is what you'll find as well. So something like training, if the firm is going through a particular problem, that's the first thing that you would seek to cut in a budget. And certainly in the government, we have experienced that as well in terms of the public sector. So I think what we really need to do, having recognized it at that macro level, is for it to be filtered through to all the stakeholder groupings, all members of the stakeholder groupings. And if we actually come up with an agreement that this is something that is an imperative for Jamaica, and we start to actually do that work, I think we will be far ahead of the game. What we need to do is really have the commitment, and a lot of times that commitment is demonstrated by the funding that is in place for it.
David, final comment from you before we go.
Yeah, I agree with Helene on most of those points, but I do want to make one other point about the whole labor market reform. I think we are, as a society, we're too much emphasis on trying to get every high school person into university. And I think we should focus more on vocational, technical, for those who are not so able to be the doctors, lawyers, and engineers, because I think they can have a better career in those areas than simply trying to pursue a degree in social science and trying to feel like, you have been trained in something for the workplace. So I'd like to see much more of that in this labor market reform process. I think we have a lot to catch up with. And I think it's also a very good pathway to entrepreneurship. For if you're a good plumber, good electrician, good air conditioner, refrigeration technician. So for those reasons, I think that's one of the areas we haven't done well in, and we need to do more of that.
Good, thank you very much. Let me thank both of you, Mrs. Helene Davis-Whyte, President of the Joint Confederation of Trade Unions, also General Secretary of the Jamaica Association of Local Government Officers. We had as well Mr. David Wan, the President of the Jamaica Employers Federation. We've been talking about labor market reform, and both of you have brought tremendous value to this discussion. I'm sure that the listeners have appreciated. Thank you both so very much. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live on Bridge 99. We're broadcasting here in Jamaica from Kingston, but we're also broadcasting now. We're connected with Irish Jam in New York. I believe we have the Honorable Beauregard online. Are you there, my friend?
Good afternoon, Mr. Golding. How are you doing, sir?
Oh, I'm big man.
There, no, go on easy.
How is New York? Are you getting cold?
No, well, today's a pretty fairly warm day. It's 56, look at clouds and
What you saying to me?
Yeah, it's not that cold today. It's not that cold.
That's good.
I heard that you celebrated a birthday yesterday.
Yeah,
so
man, yesterday. Yeah.
Happy birthday.
When you get to my age, you wish you celebrated it every 5 years, no?
Well, me past 30 already,
Yeah, I can't remember when I was that age. You have a long way to go. But it's good to hear you, and hail up all the Jamaicans up there for me.
Definitely.
We're talking labor market reform today. We've been having a very interesting discussion with Mrs. Helene Davis-Whyte, Mr. David Wan. We're going to invite now to join us Mr. Senator Kavan Gayle, who is the president of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union. Senator Kavan, are you there?
I'm here. How are you doing, Mr. Golding?
I'm very well. We're talking labor market reform today. I want to put some questions to you. Tell me, in the old days, you were too young, but I spent a year and a half at the BITU part-time.
Yes.
Under the mentorship of Lascelles Beckford.
Right.
And Barry Wright.
Right.
And I was authorized to go out there and mobilize workers and conduct negotiations and so on. And when at that time, I was in Old Harbour. Of course, we had a lot of factories in Old Harbour, the pipe factory, the Sylvania television factory, the jute factory.
Right.
When I walked,
not make the paper factory too.
Yeah. When I walked into one of those, the employers knew that even if I didn't do it, I had the power to char fire. I had the ability to char fire. And sometimes the workers were impatient that I was taking too long to char the fire.
Right.
But with all the changes that have taken place globally, the changes in the workplace driven by technology, globalization, you name it, much of that has changed. What impact has this had on trade union activity, trade union organization, trade union relationship with their members?
Well, it has changed the way trade unions now approach things at the bargaining table. It has changed the way we sit. It has changed the way we negotiate. And it has caused us to approach things in a different way, in the first instance, to educate our workers and our members. It has caused more social dialogue to take place. It has caused a different approach in terms of negotiations at the bargaining table, where it's more interest-related and more focused on partnership. So a lot has evolved. We're now talking about collaboration rather than stoking the fire that you may have stoked those years.
Well, how have your members reacted to that? Do they feel that they have lost some of the muscle that they used to have? I
tell you, they feel more because we have started to embrace the education and the change. They have taken it on. It has evolved. And they seem to be working with it very well. In fact, they are now forcing the collaborations. What we're seeing happening now is that workers are saying to the employers, listen, what's your strategic plan for the next 2 or 3 years? What type of changes you're coming with? Let us talk before you start implementing those changes. But let us talk in the genetic stage of the plans before you start implementing.
But have employers, Kavan, and I use the term broadly, but have some employers not taken advantage of this new dispensation? So when the worker is talking about, let us discuss, I don't have to discuss nothing with you no more after, you're not on the power no more.
Some have. the more backward employers have sought to stick with the old age, not sharing information. Worse if they are not a listed company on the stock exchange. So some have taken on the approach of being backward. The good thing about it is that that grouping is in the minority, most fortunately so. The more progressive employer would want to engage. I think, however, where we are having the major challenge is when it comes to crunch time, when major changes may take place that may involve restructuring of an organization and invariably lead to redundancy. And so you find that a company would want to evoke the redundancy rule rather than have the consultation that should take place as guided by the Labor Relations Code.
We talk from time to time about the growth in the what is called the informal economy, which some people claim is growing faster than the formal economy.
True.
To what extent is the informal economy being swollen because people are being displaced from the kind of factories and offices and businesses where you represent workers?
Well, let me tell you what is causing that. There's the precarious nature of employment. That little monster that is called fixed-term contract, where employers are now. It started out, when a fixed-term contract would be a 5-year contract. Then it reduced to 3. Then it reduced to 2 and maybe 1. You now have fixed-term contracts that are not defined in terms of time frame. And David may have spoken to you about those types of monsters. And you have fixed-term contracts that are 3 months and 6 months in nature, the way the worker has no real commitment, no security within the organization. That has somehow grown the informal economy because it is the same worker that don't contribute to the National Housing Trust, that don't contribute to NIS, that don't have a pension or a health scheme, but works out there. And in the final analysis, don't benefit from these historical provisions that are put in place to benefit workers. That somehow has grown the informal sector, where some of those workers are not even counted in the labor force population. And it puts pressure on the existing labor force because it's difficult to capture those when you want to use that demography in proposing policy changes that should really improve the level of the labor force.
Now tell me, to what extent do the workers themselves, or let me phrase the question a different way. There are some countries in the world that have been talking long before COVID about jobless growth, where their economy is growing at, real good pace. 3-4% in a developed countries is big growth. But what they're saying is that the number of employed persons is going to decline over time. And as I said at the opening, they don't have a problem with that because their labor force is declining. Their people are having fewer and fewer children. We are in a situation now where we're facing not just automation. We have always faced that for the last 200 years. But we're facing a kind of new technology, including artificial information. In the past, machines used to do what human limbs used to do, legs and arms. You now have technology that is doing what the human brain has always reserved as its exclusive domain. What does that mean for the workforce, Kavan? Aren't we likely to see more and more people being displaced, or people when they retire, their jobs retire with them because new technology is displacing jobs? So
before the pandemic, a lot of organizations, specifically the service organization, the financial sector, they would have invested heavily in technology. and digitalization became the new mode of conducting affairs. The pandemic itself would have triggered that a little further. And it now brings into question that a sharp focus needs to take place in terms of educating and training the workforce towards this transformation. And I'm saying the training should take place pre-entering the labor force in terms of preparing those that should enter to be kept abreast with the advantage of technology. It takes into consideration those also in the workforce to be able to be trained, develop their skill set to adapt to this type of transformation. Jobs are changing. As we are speaking right now in the world of work, a particular job may very well be changing and is going to change tomorrow and going to change next week and next year. And if Jamaica don't readily start training the workforce, start improving the skill set in the workforce to deal with this new technological revolution, then we are going to be left behind. We have to align our training to the needs of the labor force. And right now, there's a mismatch.
What about the legislative and regulatory framework? We have put in place over many, many years, and particularly during the 70s, we put in place some legislation that we were convinced at the time was not just necessary. We thought it was an entitlement that the workers had been deprived of for too long. When you talk to some private sector people, you talk to people with capital, they will tell you that a major hindrance to investment is these archaic labor-related laws. So they bitch against the severance pay provision, they bitch against maternity leave, they kick up all kind of hell because it's too difficult to dismiss a worker, and so on. To what extent are we going to have to revisit that and look at what our competitors are experiencing and the extent to which we need to align ourselves? And how are you as a trade union leader ever going to be able to confront your members to say to them that, look, as painful as this may be, this is the way we have to go? Or is that a direction that you're not going in? Tell me now.
Let me answer that question, because that is a myth and a promotion by an employer, not an investor. It's the employer who want to resist these types of legislation. When you examine those legislations, those legislations were primarily aimed to protect the working class. Nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing has changed.
But what do you say to somebody, Kavan, who will pull out a sheet of paper and say, well, no, look, I have a choice, I can invest my money here, or I can go to Damrep, or I can go to here, or I can go to there. This is their framework, this is yours, and I can't deal with your framework, so I go on. What you say to him?
Well, you see,
I'll tell you what, let me just take the time signal, I'll come right back to you, give me the response.
All right.
Welcome back, it's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99, we're also streaming through to Irish Jam in New York, and soon, they haven't told me exactly when, but soon we're going to be streaming as well at this time in the program to Toronto in Canada. We've been talking labor market reform today. We have online, and we've been talking with him, Senator Kavan Gayle, the president of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union. Kavan, I want to rephrase the question, because I want to see if I can sort of narrow down the response. Have the unions sat down and done an objective comparative analysis of our labor market environment to say, no, on this score, we are more investment friendly than most other countries. On this one, we are about average. On this one, investors may find us a little scary. And then at the bottom line now, you say, well, on balance, what kind of score do we rate ourselves in terms of investment, investment enabling? I looked at some numbers today, Kavan. I don't know if you have, well, I'm sure you would have. The World Bank puts out a ranking, and I really shouldn't give you this information before you answer the question, but I'm going to give you just the same. The World Bank puts out a ranking on labor market efficiency. I saw numbers up to 2017. I didn't see anything since that. And Jamaica got a ranking of 4.45. To give you a comparison, the US is 5.64, Singapore is 5.79, Germany is 5.03, New Zealand 5.47, United Kingdom 5.48. But then Australia is 4.68, just slightly above Jamaica.
Right.
Brazil is 3.68, way below Jamaica.
Right. And
Barbados is
population.
Barbados is 4.52, a little above us. China is 4.55. India is 4.15 below us. When I read this, I need to do some more research on it because I don't know what it is they're measuring. But when you tell me that our labor market efficiency is better than it is in Chile, for example, is better than it is in Mexico, then I'm wondering all them things that we've been discussing on this program since I started at midday today. Maybe we're barking up a wrong tree, are we?
I remember going to a meeting in Lima, Peru, to discuss Scotiabank, with Scotiabank aligned trade unionists in South and Central America. And the BITU came away being one of the top trade unions in terms of provisions made for the working class. We're way ahead of them. We're way ahead in terms of efficiency. We're way ahead in terms of efficiency ratio. We're way ahead in terms of even adapting to change. And we are way ahead in some of our labor standards.
Yeah, but I want to pin you down now. Have you sat down with the Helene Davis-Whytes of this world and the Granville Valentines? Have you sat down with your colleagues and said, hey, let us look at our environment and let us compare it with other countries, because it is in our interest for investors to want to come here and set up business and create jobs and provide employment for our people. Has that been done?
And let me tell you where we have been promoting this. We have a unit at area in the Ministry of Labor called the Labor Advisory Commission, where we sit with the employers.
Yes.
And the minister and the permanent secretary on a quarterly basis. And this is where this discussion takes place.
Is it taking place?
Our own Confederation of Trade Unions, we have been pushing this. And let me deal with again the myth, Bruce, around an investor believing that we have bad labor laws. Right? What I think the employers should promote more is not the legislation that we provide that we have taken from the Commonwealth, not the legislation that our own colleagues in the region in some instances have more improved legislation, but not having this myth being promoted. But let us promote where we can talk about training and educating the workers. Let us promote where we can improve the technological advancement and the innovation. Let us promote where we can talk about increasing the level of productivity. That's an area that we need to focus on. Our level of productivity is going not in the most desired direction.
Fair enough, Kavan, but I know that you are smart enough and sensitive enough to know that when you're talking about policies, particularly when you're talking about institutional changes, whatever we do has to be data-driven. And I really would love if you were able to tell me, or if you give me a commitment that you're going to pursue it, that a serious analysis be done of our regulatory environment here, item by item, broken down, to see how we compare with other countries that are attracting investment. But, I remember some time ago, and this is a long, long time ago, I remember speaking with a big investor in London who had a lot of investments in the Caribbean. And he said to me, when I said to him, I said, well, how come? I mean, you are in this Caribbean country, that Caribbean country. What about Jamaica? I said, and before he answered, I was trying to see if I could help him out. I said to him, I said, well, I know we have a crime problem, but, government is putting in some measures to try to get on top of that. And I mentioned one or two other things. And he kept shaking his head. He said, none of those bother me. What bothers me is my business can't run on the basis of, people, the factory is up and running today, or the business is up and running today, and tomorrow I hear that my managers can't get in because there's a strike. They dismiss a worker, and all of a sudden we now have to go negotiate and compensate that worker far more than the worker's salary accumulated. His thing was the labor laws, right? So whether it is myth, whether it is perception, I think it is important for us to really get some data to drive it. I'm going to do so. I only looked at it this morning, and because I was rushing to get into the studio, I couldn't get into the details. But I really want to look at this World Bank labor market efficiency ranking, which really gives me a completely different picture than I had mentally before when they said that Jamaica is ranked better than, we are ranked better than France. France is 435, we are 445.
We have been reducing the number of labor unrest taking place. We're no longer having these wholesale strikes of the past that used to ripple through the system in the 90s. Because we have changed the way we do things. Yeah? The trade unions now are more accommodating. We want to have the discussions at the bargaining table. That's still not going to stop us from dealing with unfair and unjust dismissals. But there's a medium in which to deal with that those matters go before the Industrial Disputes Tribunal, which is really the workman's court. So those matters are being dealt with. But I agree with you with one thing, in that if we are going to inform ourselves of policy changes and policy shifts, then it must be driven by data. And I too would want to examine that data in terms of the efficiency that we're talking about. What is it that we're really comparing with as a small, independent, developing state? But that's also important, not to place us in a rubric with others that are more of a developed nature that may have greater social support than Jamaica. And as you talk about social support, the pandemic itself brought into sharp focus the need for what would be considered unemployment insurance. The care packages was a good enough support by the government, but it tells us that in the event of another catastrophic pandemic of this nature, we're going to have to put in place a policy that supports something like unemployment insurance, that when the worker is out there, beyond the 120 days that is being prescribed by the provision in law for layoff, they need some sort of a support.
Yes.
Yeah? These are things that we need to look at. We need to, you have always said, it's worthwhile to use something like, a catastrophe to make changes.
Make use of make good use of a crisis.
Make good use of a crisis.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we need to do. I am concerned about our level of productivity. I'm not afraid of having discussions around performance-driven bargaining, including the public sector. Because we have to continue transforming the public sector to provide greater service to the private sector that are the enablers of growth in the economy. One is related and dependent on the other in order to survive. And these are changes that we must continue to make.
Yeah. Kavan, I want to thank you very much. We're coming towards it. I have one little segment left, but I want to thank you for coming on, for helping us with this discussion. We've been talking labor market reform and your own contribution to that discussion has really been helpful and instructive. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good.
Anytime.
Good. Thank you. We're coming towards the last lap now. 1:45 and 30 seconds. And we have coming on now Mr. Wayne Chen. Wayne was, well, he can clarify when he comes on. Wayne was the president, I believe, or the general secretary of the Caribbean Employers Federation. Wayne, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Prime Minister. How are you doing?
Age is getting the better of me. What were you in the Caribbean Employers something?
Well, I continue to be, I don't know why they don't fire me, I continue to be the president of the Caribbean Employers Confederation.
I see. Okay. All right. Now that we got that clear. We're talking labor market reform today. And in that discussion, and perhaps I'm to be blamed for this, I have kind of skewed the discussion towards the issue of labor productivity. I had David Wan on earlier, and I pointed out to him, and he concurred, that the data shows that not only has labor productivity been declining, but total factor productivity, which should include capital and management and so on, has been declining. As a matter of fact, when I looked at total factor productivity, the decline over the last 20 years has been sharper than the labor, marginally sharper than the labor productivity decline. Evidently, we're getting something wrong. So many changes have taken place in the last 20 years, Wayne, in terms of the workplace environment, the production processes, whether it is goods or services. Have we been responsive enough, or are we being left behind?
I'll put this in this way. Collectively, we are being left behind. But in terms of specific firms and individuals, we have people who are keeping up with the best in the world. What we have in Jamaica is really a divide between the highly productive and the competitive, and those that are still not competitive and are falling behind the rest of the world.
Is there a correlation, Wayne? Is there a correlation? We talk about those that are kind of on the ball and those that are lagging behind. Is there a correlation in terms of leadership? Is it that the ones who are on the cutting edge are the ones that are being led, directed, managed by this new generation of youngsters that we have, I can't keep up with them, while the others are being led by old fogies like me?
That is a bit of it, but we also have to rethink our whole concept of what a job looks like. Once upon a time, a job is something you leave high school and you go bigger work, if you understand what I'm saying. More and more we see the opportunities opening up, the challenges, but also the opportunities of globalization. We see other countries going through rapid digital transformation. And I don't say, we talk about it, but we tend to be a step behind in many of the things. We see it has long been recognized in Jamaica. And I want to take you back very quickly. When we inherited an educational system at the time of independence in 1962, we inherited something from the British that was designed for a plantation economy. And it had very good institutions to develop a very small cadre of leaders, professionals, managers, and of that. That's so you know, a Jamaica College, a Cornwall College, a Monroe, a St. Hilda's, and so on. But at the time of independence, a significant percentage, my guesstimate is somewhere around a third, of young Jamaicans of school age were not even in school. So in the 60s, you had a rapid expansion in the number of classroom spaces, and we don't talk enough about it. In the 70s, the focus was on access. But here we have today, in 2021, where under 20% of the students of the relevant age that sit CSEC mathematics don't pass. Only about a third to 40% are passing English. Yet still, these are the two core subjects of the 5 that will be deemed success when you leave high school. So the education base has not kept up with the demands of a competitive economy. And we can go on and on that. the fact is that I think Helene earlier spoke to the lack of certified skills in the workforce. We have a workforce of maybe 1.3 million, but those with some certifiable skill are still in the low hundreds of thousands. I think maybe a third of the workforce.
That's what the PIOJ figure says. Yes.
Yes. So you can see the disjunction. So you have highly skilled Jamaicans who will work anywhere in the world. You have the NCBs and JMMBs of the world, and pretty much in the tourism sector. It should be of note that just before the pandemic struck us in March of last year, we had around 39,000 people employed in business process outsourcing, and I want to come back to that. That number dipped precipitously after the onset of the pandemic, but it rebounded by the middle of this year to 44,000, with a projection that by the end of March in the new year, in 2022, employment in that sector should be somewhere around 53,000. But it gives a hint of what the future can look like.
Let me ask you this, though. Because from your Caribbean Employers Confederation group, and you interface with a lot of employers, and those employers, of course, would include a lot of investors.
Mm-hmm.
If you talk to an investor about investing in Jamaica, and he were to express reservations, what it is that would drive those reservations, and to what extent is the labor market environment one of those?
Let me be blunt. Many investors have found workarounds in the Jamaican environment. The cost of formally employing someone in Jamaica is quite high, and because of the payroll taxes, meaning the NHC, the education tax, and so on and so forth. Also, the cost of separation is quite high. So what you tend to find that has risen and if you look around you to what have been the big high employment, not just a high capital, but a high employment foreign investments in recent times. Tourism, you've seen a huge expansion in the number of hotel rooms in Jamaica over the last 25, 30 years. But the hospitality sector, the hotels, really employ contract labor, very few tenured employees. As I mentioned earlier, the BPO sector has seen the biggest increase in employment, all contract workers. The security industry, I don't know what the number is now, but I guess it's somewhere around 12 to 15,000, all contract workers.
But then Wayne,
construction industry.
Help me with my dilemma, though, Wayne. I don't know if you were listening, but I mentioned to Kavan that I had a look today at the ranking that the World Bank has given us in terms of the labor market efficiency index.
Yes, I heard it.
And they gave us a ranking which puts us ahead of Chile, India, Mexico, Trinidad, Brazil, Argentina. What I'm trying to understand.
No. In the scheme of things, we are somewhere in the middle. I mean, I think France is behind us.
Yes.
Because they have very rigid labor laws. I mean, Italy is probably behind us. So a lot of the social democracies in Western Europe will be behind Jamaica. A lot of Latin America, Mexico, Chile, as you mentioned, Brazil would be behind us. So labor laws in Jamaica, they are challenging, but they are not the biggest problem. I will submit that the biggest problem is really, it's one is education and training, and two is structural issues within the wider economy that would affect our competitiveness.
What do we need to do? What do we need to do to lend greater agility to our response to the changing environment? I am frightened, you see, by artificial intelligence and what it is likely to do over the next 10 years. I know somebody, for example, a lawyer, who was engaged abroad. Basically, he works with a big legal firm, basically work from home. And what he would do is that they deal with a lot of consumer claims, no? That sometimes end up in court. And his job basically was to go through the complaint, look at the documentation, and basically prepare a brief for the lawyers who are going to argue it in court. And he told me that his job was made redundant because you have artificial intelligence, something now that's doing what he used to do. So, I mean, we're talking about machines now that not only doing what legs and arms used to do before, but are now doing what brains used to do.
You're entirely correct in that. But, projecting forwards, and, the danger always is planning for a world of today when tomorrow is already coming on us tomorrow. The thing that we have to build into our system is agility, adaptability, critical thinking. They are foundational skills that we have to be not only teaching students in schools, but reskilling people already working.
Well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that with the kind of output of our school system that you just spoke about and you just draw some statistics on?
We have to focus our resources.
We're two out of every 3 workers in Jamaica don't have any formal training.
And if we continue in that mode, we'll continue to be poor. In fact, we'll continue to get poorer. We won't just continue to be poor, we'll get poorer. And even though, as I pointed out, we might have 52,000 BPO jobs by March, if we are not upskilling even these in that sector.
What's the level of...
I don't want people to think that a BPO now is only a big Sutherland Global employing thousands of people. My daughter was here for 7 months. She works in London. And I called her one day after the pandemic and said, "You're working from home. Why you don't come and work from home in Jamaica?" She came home and worked from home in Jamaica for 7 months, but continually moving her skills upwards.
Is there any dialogue taking place, Wayne, and what is the quality of that dialogue at the Caribbean level, at the Jamaican level, between the critical stakeholders, the government, the employers, the trade unions? Is there dialogue taking place to say, no, hey, this thing is up on us. How are we going to respond? Or are we going... It took 20 years after the George Eaton-led committee report on labor market reform before the Reform Commission was set up. Are we going to spend another 20 years before we wrap our hands around what is happening now?
I pray not. I think the LAC, Helene adverted to it earlier, and Kavan certainly mentioned it earlier. Jamaica has had a phenomenal little committee down at the Ministry of Labor that has been in operation since the early 1990s. And Jamaica has gone through, as you would know, we had a huge financial meltdown in the 90s, huge fallout. We have had a fiscal compression/adjustment program over the last 10 years. But Jamaica has done it without any insurrection, without any tires burning in the street, unlike every other country that has gone through similar adjustments. The fact is that it is the government, and I'm going to be frank here, the trade unions and the employers, and I can speak of Jamaica, are at one of the need. After the Eaton report, which was 1995-96, I believe. Remember, we had a review chaired by Alvin Wint maybe 10 years ago. We had the report to the labor market reform, championed by Lloyd Goodley and others, chaired by Marshall Hall, that was presented maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We had a recent one by Neville Ying. So it's not a shortage of reports and red flags or warnings to the policymakers that we need to take this thing seriously and act with some urgency. There are structural issues, difficult structural issues, issues that would involve political will. I mean, you might have recalled when I don't remember which administration, but just a few years ago, there was an attempt to pay math teachers better. Give me that, to give one example. And there was resistance from the teachers' union.
Yes. We're not running out of time, and they're giving me the wrap-up signal.
On this. But we need to train our people,
yes,
and we need to take advantage of the opportunities.
Wayne, thanks a whole lot. You've been very helpful to the discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, good care and happy belated birthday.
Cool. Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the program, Jamaica Live for today. We will be back here next week, Monday. We expect, God willing. But I'm actually going to be back here on Bridge on Wednesday when I will be joining Ronnie Thwaites, Public Eye with Ronnie Thwaites and Pernell Charles. PJ Patterson and I will be his guest on the program. We're going to be talking constitutional reform. an important issue. So I'm going to see you on Wednesday, but Jamaica Live will be back here next week, Monday at midday. God bless you. Have a good week.